Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. My name's Mike, and I didn't want to leave the city, not at first. But after the years spent working as a forest ranger, the noise, the traffic, the constant pressure, it all became too much. I needed peace, and this small town nestled on the outskirts of a sprawling forest seemed like the perfect escape. The house I bought sat on a few acres, far enough from the neighbors to give me some solitude, but close enough to the town that I wouldn't feel completely cut off. Or so I thought. The town's residents weren't exactly thrilled about my move. They didn't say it outright, but I could feel their hesitation. People like me, outsiders, didn't tend to stick around, and I get it. This town's been around for decades, maybe longer, and its ways run deep. But I was determined to make it work, so I kept to myself, focused on my work, and started to explore the surrounding woods when I had the chance. There was one person, though, who I couldn't quite figure out. My neighbor, Adam. I hadn't seen much of him, but I'd heard plenty. A reclusive figure, he kept to himself, hardly ever leaving his property. It wasn't the kind of house that drew attention. Nothing remarkable about it. But there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. The town whispered about him, though no one would say anything concrete. Some said he was eccentric, others hinted at darker things I couldn't shake from my mind once I started hearing them. What really piqued my curiosity, though, were the sounds. At night, from my porch, I'd hear it. Deep growls like an animal in distress, coming from Adam's yard. At first, I thought I was hearing things, or maybe it was just a wild animal nearby. But the sounds became more frequent and more distinct as the days went on. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before, not in my years in the woods. These sounds felt deliberate. I tried not to let it bother me, but after a few nights, I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was too strange. One evening, when the growls were louder than usual, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe a caged animal, maybe something more sinister. But whatever it was, I needed to know. I slipped through the trees, keeping to the shadows, careful not to make a sound. Adam's house was a good distance from mine, but as I approached, the growls grew louder. They were coming from behind his barn. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept closer. The barn was dark, with only the faintest light creeping through the cracks in the walls. I could hear the creature now, thrashing against something, a soft rustling followed by another growl. My pulse quickened as I moved closer to the corner of the barn, and that's when I saw it. A cage hidden just behind a stack of firewood. Inside, something was pacing, something that wasn't quite animal, but wasn't quite human either. I froze, staring in disbelief. The creature in the cage had glowing eyes, like two molten orbs that seemed to burn right through the darkness. It wasn't huge, but it had the build of something powerful, its muscular form twisted in ways that felt unnatural. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't an ordinary animal. Something far worse was going on here. The sight of the creature in the cage was burned into my mind as I made my way back to my house. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It didn't add up. Adam had always been a strange guy, but this was something else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something far darker than I had anticipated when I first moved here. The next few days were a blur. I tried to go about my work as usual, but every time I stepped outside, my mind drifted back to that cage. I couldn't focus, couldn't stop thinking about the creature, about Adam's connection to it. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The town was tight-lipped about Adam, and if I asked anyone directly, I'd likely end up with more gossip than facts, so I decided to confront him. The evening was overcast, the kind of sky that made everything feel muted, like the world was holding its breath. I walked down the dirt road that separated our properties, my hands clenched at my sides. I wasn't sure what I was going to say to Adam, but I knew I had to find out what was going on. As I neared his house, I noticed the front door was ajar, the light from inside spilling out onto the porch in a soft glow. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked. The door creaked open just a crack, and I was greeted by the faint smell of something rancid like old meat. Adam stood there in the doorway, his face partially obscured by a dark, unkempt beard. His eyes were narrow, and he didn't look surprised to see me, which was odd. It was as if he'd been expecting me. "You've been hearing it too, haven't you?" Adam asked, his voice rough and hoarse, like it hadn't been used much. I nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. "What's going on, Adam? What are you keeping back there?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze drifting past me to the trees that lined the edge of the property. His eyes seemed distant, almost as if he were lost in thought. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lower this time. "It's not what you think," he said, the words heavy with a strange kind of reverence. It's something old. It's part of this land. And I've been feeding it, keeping it contained. But soon, it'll be free." I wasn't sure what he meant, but the words sent a chill down my spine. Something old, contained. I could feel the unease growing in the pit of my stomach. "Adam, you're talking about an animal, aren't you? It doesn't belong here." He shook his head, the corners of his mouth twitching into a strange smile. "No, not an animal. A creature. A guardian, if you will. And it's tied to this place, to the land itself. It's been here long before either of us, and it will be here long after." Before I could respond, Adam stepped back from the door and motioned for me to follow. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As we walked down the narrow path to the barn, Adam's words echoed in my mind. A guardian? Was he out of his mind? Or was there something deeper to this? I had to know. We reached the barn, and I could see the cage from where I stood. The creature was still inside, pacing back and forth, but now it seemed agitated, like it sensed us approaching. Its growls were louder, more desperate. I stepped closer, my eyes never leaving it, but Adam stopped me with a hand on my arm. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "It's not just a creature. It's part of the land. And soon, when the moon is full, it will be free. It's the only way to restore balance." I felt my heart skip a beat. Restore balance? What kind of madness was this? The creature was more than just an animal. It was something ancient, something Adam believed had a purpose, something that could unleash chaos upon the world. "I can't let you do this, Adam," I said, my voice firm. "This thing doesn't belong here. It's dangerous. It's out of control." Adam's gaze hardened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something dark in his eyes. "You don't know anything about it," he spat. "You can't understand, but you will. Soon, you'll see what it can do." I stood there, frozen, trying to process everything I just heard. The full moon was only days away. I had to stop him. But how? How could I possibly face whatever this creature was? And if Adam was willing to release it, then he was as dangerous as the creature itself. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and dread. I couldn't stop thinking about what Adam had said. A guardian? A creature tied to the land? I couldn't make sense of it, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to stop whatever was about to happen. I couldn't just sit by and let Adam release whatever this thing was into the world. But how could I, a simple forest ranger, possibly confront something like that? I spent the following nights outside, watching the sky, listening for any sign of movement from Adam's property. The growls had stopped for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. I spent hours trying to find any kind of evidence, but the more I searched, the more questions I had. It wasn't until the night of the full moon that I realized how much time had passed, and how much danger was looming. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the land. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to take one last look around. As I walked down the road to Adam's house, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something felt different, something I couldn't quite explain. I could hear it now, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps in the woods just beyond the edge of Adam's property. Someone, or something, was moving out there. I approached the barn cautiously, my heart racing in my chest. The door was cracked open, and a faint light flickered from inside. As I drew closer, I saw Adam standing at the cage, his back to me, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. He was muttering to himself, something about the creature being free at last, about the balance being restored. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to stop him, and I had to do it now. As I stepped forward, the door creaked behind me, and I froze. "Mike," a voice rasped from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." I turned, and there stood Adam, his face pale, his eyes wide with a strange intensity. He looked almost unrecognizable, as though whatever he'd been planning had driven him to the brink of madness. "Get out of here, Adam," I said, my voice steady despite the rising panic in my chest. "You don't know what you're doing." This thing, it's not some kind of guardian. It's dangerous. You're going to get us all killed." Adam laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You still don't understand. It's not just an animal. It's a force of nature, something older than any of us. It's part of this land, and it needs to be free." He reached out, his hand shaking as he moved toward the cage, and that's when I saw it. The creature, it had grown larger, more menacing, its form twisted and grotesque. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural intelligence, and it paced back and forth, snarling as if it could sense the impending release. "You can't control it, Adam," I said, my voice breaking. "It's too dangerous. We have to stop it." But Adam's expression didn't change. He was beyond reason, lost in his obsession with the creature and its supposed connection to the land. I knew then that there was only one way to stop this madness. I had to destroy the creature before Adam could release it. I lunged toward the cage, hoping to somehow get to the lock before Adam could. But he was quicker. He shoved me aside, his grip tightening around a small knife he had hidden in his jacket. "Stay out of it, Mike," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't understand. I have to do this. I have to set it free." The creature was almost frenzied now, its growls turning into a terrifying roar. It was getting closer to the bars of the cage, its claws scraping against the metal as it pushed its way forward. I couldn't wait any longer. In one swift motion, I tackled Adam to the ground, knocking the knife out of his hand. The creature howled in rage, its eyes burning with fury as it reached through the bars, desperate to escape. I could feel the heat of its gaze as it snapped, its jaws just inches from my face. I had to act fast. "Mike," Adam screamed, his hands gripping my arm as he tried to pull me off. "You don't know what you're doing. You can't stop it." I pushed him off me, my chest heaving as I scrambled for the lock. With a quick wrench of my hands, the cage door flew open, and the creature surged forward, its monstrous form breaking free. It let out a blood-curdling roar that echoed through the woods, shaking the very ground beneath us. The creature erupted from the cage with a speed that left me no time to react. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a grotesque fusion of human and animal, its limbs twisted and elongated, its skin mottled with patches of fur and scales. It stood there for a moment, towering over us, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. I could feel the air crackling with the raw energy it exuded, the very atmosphere thick with a primal rage. Adam was frozen in place, his face a mask of awe and fear. "It's free," he whispered, his voice reverent, almost worshipful. "It's free." But I wasn't about to let it run rampant through the town, no matter what Adam believed. This creature wasn't some ancient guardian. It was a terror, and it was only going to destroy everything in its path. I scrambled backward, my heart racing as I reached for my flashlight, the only tool I had on hand. It was no match for what I was facing, but it was all I had. I shined it directly at the creature's face, hoping to disorient it, but the beast barely flinched. It let out another deafening roar, this time shaking the trees around us. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I stumbled, trying to regain my balance. Adam's voice broke through the chaos. "Don't hurt it," he begged, his eyes wide and wild. "It's part of the land. It needs to be free." "Your land is cursed," I shouted back, my voice breaking with the weight of my words. "This thing is nothing but a monster. You can't control it, Adam. You never could." The creature took a step forward, its claws scraping against the earth, leaving deep gouges in the ground. It seemed to be deciding whether to attack, its eyes shifting between me and Adam, its mouth dripping with saliva. I knew I had seconds, maybe less, before it pounced. I glanced at Adam one last time. He was still standing there, a fool in the face of his own creation, but something in his eyes had shifted. The reverence had faded, replaced by a dawning horror. He was starting to realize that the creature wasn't a guardian, but a nightmare that he had unleashed, and there was no going back. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the dirt as I headed toward the town. I had to warn the others, get them to safety. But even as I ran, I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing louder with every passing second. I could hear Adam's voice faintly in the distance, but I didn't stop. "Please, Mike, don't leave me with it," he yelled, his tone desperate. But I couldn't help him. The creature was beyond saving, and so was Adam. He had let this thing loose, and now we were all going to pay the price. I reached the edge of town and burst into the nearest house, where a group of townsfolk were gathered. They looked up in confusion as I barged in, my breath ragged, my face pale with fear. "It's here," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "The creature Adam was keeping. It's free. We need to leave. Now." A few of them stood up, hesitant, but the urgency in my voice was enough to get them moving. "Where's Adam?" one of the men asked, his eyes darting to the door. I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't have time for questions. I had to stop the creature before it tore the town apart. But as I turned to leave, a loud crash echoed from outside. The creature had arrived. I didn't look back. I couldn't. There was no time to waste. The town had to be evacuated. Now, before it was too late. The streets of the town were eerily quiet as I rushed through them, my thoughts racing faster than my legs could carry me. The air was thick with tension, and every sound, no matter how small, sent my heart into overdrive. I could hear the creature's growls in the distance, each one growing louder, closer. It was getting closer to the town, and I had no idea how long we had before it reached us. I reached the sheriff's office, slamming the door open with more force than I intended. Inside, Sheriff Thompson looked up from his desk, his face a mix of annoyance and curiosity. But the look in my eyes must have told him everything he needed to know. "Mike?" he asked, standing up, concern flashing across his face. "What's going on?" "There's a creature," I panted, my words spilling out in a frantic rush. "Adam, he kept it locked up. It's out. It's free, and it's heading for the town. You've got to get everyone out of here. Now." The sheriff's brow furrowed as he processed my words. "What the hell are you talking about, Mike? A creature? Is this some sort of joke?" "I'm not joking," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not human. It's God. You have to see it for yourself. It's a monster. Adam let it loose, and now it's coming for us. We have to leave before it gets here." For a moment, the sheriff stood there frozen, as if trying to decide whether to believe me or not. Then, without a word, he grabbed his radio and started speaking into it, his tone sharp and urgent. "We've got an emergency," he said. "Everyone needs to evacuate the town immediately. We've got a situation." I could hear the crackling of static on the other end as he relayed orders to his deputies. Within minutes, the sheriff had mobilized the town, sending people to their homes and to the outskirts to warn anyone who hadn't yet heard. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. We didn't have time to get everyone out. "Mike," Sheriff Thompson said, turning back to me. "What the hell is this thing? You said Adam was involved." I nodded, trying to steady my breath. "He thought it was a guardian of some kind, a creature tied to the land. But it's not. It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's part animal, part human, and it's angry. It's been locked up for years, and now it's free." The sheriff stared at me, disbelief still on his face. But the distant sounds of crashing trees and the low growls in the background made it clear he could no longer ignore the danger. "All right, Mike," he said, his voice gruff. "Let's go stop this thing." We rushed to the back of the office, where a squad car waited, its engine running. As we climbed in, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. There was no stopping this creature, not unless we acted quickly, and even then, I wasn't sure we stood a chance. We sped toward the outskirts of town, the sound of the creature's roars growing louder with each passing second. The sheriff's deputies had set up a perimeter, but the creature was too powerful to contain with just a few men and some makeshift barricades. As we neared the woods, I could see the trees shaking, branches snapping as the creature tore its way through the forest. The sheriff hit the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. "This is it," he said grimly. "Get ready." I grabbed the rifle from the back seat, my hands trembling as I loaded it. My mind raced with thoughts of how to stop the creature, but I knew deep down that whatever happened, it wouldn't be easy. The thing was unstoppable, a force of nature in every sense of the word. As we stepped out of the car, the full moon illuminated the chaos before us. The creature had reached the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes scanning the area. Its massive form moved with an unnatural grace, its every step sending vibrations through the ground. "It's not just a monster," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's a curse." Sheriff Thompson didn't respond. He just nodded, his eyes locked on the creature as it slowly approached. And then it stopped. The creature turned its head, its eyes narrowing as it focused on us. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still, and then it let out a roar so deafening that it made the air itself vibrate. It charged. "Get down," I shouted, but it was too late. The creature's charge was like a freight train. Unstoppable and terrifying. I barely had time to duck behind a nearby rock before it barreled past, its massive body shaking the ground beneath my feet. My heart raced and my mind scrambled to catch up. This wasn't a fight we could win with brute force. This was survival. The sheriff fired his gun, but the bullet seemed to have no effect. The creature howled in frustration, its claws raking through the air as it turned to face us. The moonlight glinted off its sharp, jagged features, giving it an otherworldly, almost demonic appearance. For a moment, I saw something in its eyes. A flicker of the man Adam had once been, the one who had kept the creature locked away. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by raw, primal rage. "Get to the truck," Sheriff Thompson shouted, his voice strained. "We need to regroup." I nodded, but I didn't move. I had no intention of running. Not now. Not after everything we had seen. I was done running from this nightmare. I stood, my hands still clutching the rifle, and I fired a shot into the air. The creature paused, its head snapping toward the sound. It was drawn to the noise, distracted for just a second. That was all I needed. "Come on," I yelled at the sheriff, motioning for him to take cover behind another set of rocks. He didn't hesitate. He followed my lead, both of us trying to outmaneuver the creature as it turned back toward us, its growls vibrating through the air like thunder. I knew we didn't have much time. The town was still in danger. The creature was out of control, and Adam, God Adam, was still somewhere in the woods, watching it all unfold, still believing that this was somehow the right thing to do. "We have to stop it before it gets to the town," I said to the sheriff as we moved into position. "If it makes it to the main street, it'll tear the place apart. We need to take it down here before it has the chance to destroy everything we care about." The sheriff nodded grimly. "You think we can kill it?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "But we have to try." I checked the rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. The creature was still coming toward us, its massive frame moving with unnatural speed. I could see its muscles rippling under its fur as it lunged toward us, its mouth wide open, revealing rows of teeth like daggers. I fired. The shot didn't hit. It missed by inches, and the creature snarled, fury flashing in its eyes. But it didn't stop. It charged again. "Mike, look out." The sheriff's warning came too late. The creature was on me before I could react, slamming into me with the force of a freight train. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me as the creature's hot breath burned my skin. It loomed over me, its claws coming down with deadly precision. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. My thoughts raced, but my body felt frozen. I reached for my knife, hoping to get a shot in, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. The creature's strength was overwhelming, and I was nothing more than a man against a beast. But just as the creature's claws were about to strike, I heard a gunshot. The creature faltered, its eyes flickering as it turned to look at the sheriff. Another shot rang out, this time hitting its shoulder, but still, it didn't fall. I didn't hesitate. I lunged for the rifle I had discarded earlier, rolling onto my back to get a better angle. I aimed for the creature's head, steadying my breath. I couldn't afford to miss this time. I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and this time it struck true. The creature let out a horrific screech, its body jerking as the bullet pierced its skull. It staggered back, its growls turning into an almost pitiful whimper. For a moment it seemed confused, as if it couldn't understand why it was dying. Then, with a final roar, it collapsed to the ground, its body crumpling in a heap. The air fell silent. My heart was still racing, my hands trembling, but the danger was over. The creature was dead. I stood up slowly, my knees shaking with exhaustion, and looked at the sheriff. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "It's done," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's over." The sheriff nodded, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "What about Adam?" he asked. I looked around, but Adam was nowhere to be seen. He was still out there, somewhere in the woods, lost to his obsession. And I knew that we would never truly be free of the darkness he had unleashed. But for now, at least the town was safe. We called in the authorities, and the body of the creature was taken away. Adam's fate was left in their hands, though I knew deep down that he would never be the same again. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the land, the cursed ancient land, still held secrets, and Adam's connection to it had only scratched the surface. The town began to rebuild, but I would never forget the beast next door and the madness that had come with it. Back in April of 2013, I went through something that I haven't been able to talk about. I was paid a significant amount of money to stay quiet in return for signing a 10-year agreement to shut the hell up. Now that the time is up, I've considered my options. I could just let this go and never speak of it again. I won't gain anything from speaking out, and I got a lot to lose. But then again, this is just an anonymous post online. Words have less meaning that way. West Virginia. It was hotter than usual, without a whiff of wind. I was coming home from a visit to my aunt. She'd broken her leg and couldn't leave her house. I was making my way back home, taking the I-64 out of Lewisburg. It started with the radio. It was playing that one Macklemore song I'd heard 100 times over. The sound was cutting in and out in a quick staccato, then disappeared completely. I could hear cars honking up front as a line began to form. There was a sway in the trees as if greater and greater pressure was being put on them. I could hear wind rushing against the left side of the car, forcing me to pull the other way to compensate. I closed the sunroof as a dust cloud blew past, staining the windshield. Then a rumble. It sounded like thunder, but from the ground. Like a groaning bellow, growing louder and clearer by the second. As it reached its peak, I could see trees toppling over. A small Kia got pushed off balance and swerved off the road. As the sound died down, the road devolved into chaos. Some were desperately changing lanes, others were stepping on the brakes. I got my door scraped as the car behind me sped past. The radio was playing an automated message. A local emergency alert, referred to as a geological event. We were asked to turn off all air conditioning, slow down, and divert to the nearest exit. It repeated in a monotone voice. Geological event. No air conditioning. Slow down. Divert to nearest exit. Minutes passed. There was a line forming further down the road. Police officers blocking the lanes in all directions, leaving a highway exit as the only option. Some folks were trying to push past the barricades, but were forced back at gunpoint. I could see officers wearing gas masks and riot shields. We were waved in. I followed the exit and got directed to the right. There was an open field that was used as a sort of impromptu parking lot. Cars were being waved in and parked in a way that boxed us in, leaving no room for us to open our doors in either direction, unless we got parked at the edge. 4 lines of cars with about 10-15 vehicles per line. Surplus vehicles were directed further down the road. The place was packed. I got stuck in the second row, about 6 cars in. Pretty much everyone around me were on their phones. I didn't have anyone to call, but there seemed to be an issue getting a signal through. The radio was still repeating the emergency message. Voices were getting louder. A man 2 cars to my left leaned out of a gap in the door, screaming at the officers to answer his question. They responded immediately with a warning shot, straight into the air. "Stay in your vehicle," they screamed. "Lock your doors. I'm not telling you again." A couple of folks were filming, but there seemed to be trouble uploading. We were losing bandwidth. It didn't take long until phone signals were completely blocked. I think a video or 2 of that officer firing into the air made it online. They were patrolling back and forth. We were told to stay in our vehicles. Windows up. Doors closed and locked. Engines off. I could hear people talking in the other cars. Someone said there'd been a natural gas leak from the geological event, and that combustible engines could spark an explosion. Others were talking about a terrorist attack. There were no answers, and the officers weren't eager to talk. After about an hour, things were getting ugly. People were hungry, thirsty, and restless. One officer stepped up on the front cars, handing out water bottles, crackers, and processed cheese slices. He had to step from one car to another, denting the hoods with his steel-tipped shoes. They were also handing out thick black plastic hygiene bags for people who needed to relieve themselves. Use them, seal them, drop them out the door, then lock up and wait. I'd crawled into the back seat, pulled down my cap, and tried to relax. I'd been playing some games on my phone, but the battery was running low. I wanted to save some, so I settled for having a nap instead. The sweat was stinging my eyes, not because of how warm it was, but because of how nervous I was. No matter what I did, I felt trapped, and the car felt smaller and smaller. I couldn't get out if I wanted to, and it physically hurt me to think about how little control I had. Is that what claustrophobia feels like? A couple of officers were discussing something by the front line. One of them had a white cotton glove on, which he used to wipe off the hood of one of the front cars. The glove was taken off and put into a bag, which in turn was sealed with a hot air gun. I was getting the impression that our cars had been covered in something. I wasn't the only one considering it. There were 2 college kids in the car to my left, and they were discussing it too. Anthrax, one of them said. Gotta be. Nah, gold dust, the other chuckled. They don't want to share. You know what? The first groaned. I honest to God hope you're right. You're not, but I hope you are. F you. I joined in the conversation shortly after. I offered another explanation, something combustible. Something that might blow up if we started our cars. They were willing to consider this. The car behind me couldn't hear us, but the driver held up a notebook with the text. If we do know what it's go to be aliens. I couldn't tell if they were serious, but they weren't laughing about it. A man in his 50s and what looked like his daughter. There were a couple of other folks in the other cars. A man in a black shirt, sort of looked like a preacher without a collar. 2 middle-aged women with a kid in the back seat. A fat man blaring Johnny Cash from his stereo. A couple with a teenage son who couldn't stop drumming on the windows. We'd been stuck for about 2, maybe 2.5 hours when a truck rolled in. One of those with a large water tank. It was unmarked, looked civilian. As it rolled in, they were calling out on the megaphone. We'll be hosing your vehicles down, they said. Keep everything locked and closed. Then we'll be covering your vehicle with protective plastic while we wait for it to dry. After that, we'll start letting you go in an orderly manner. I repeat. Most of us were relieved. It was only a matter of time now. It was getting dark. They were getting up on the cars, hosing them down thoroughly. It smelled of chlorine, so maybe they'd mixed something into the water. As they came to my car, they stepped up on it and double-checked the sunroof, making sure it was locked and secured. They sprayed the car down, bathing it in chemical stink. The kind that gets stuck to the back of your throat. It took a long time for them to finish, at least an hour or 2. After that, they were rolling out a kind of plastic cover at the short side of the lot. The kind you use to protect pools or rain covers for football fields. They used 2 squad cars to slowly drape the thing over the entire lot, securing the edges with large rocks. Please stay calm, they called out as the plastic crawled over us. I know this is uncomfortable, but this is for your own safety. Once the cleaning is done, you will be free to go. Stay inside your vehicle at all times. I repeat. I did as I was told. I stayed inside, and I watched that plastic cover sweep over me. It felt like getting buried alive. All lights went out, leaving me in complete darkness, accompanied only by the vague, disembodied voices of the others. The college kids were talking about where they were going to go after this. Someone was honking, not sure if it was to show support or discontent. Someone else was cheering. I took my last swig of water, washing down my final plain cracker. I got back in the driver's seat. I could hear as they finished moving the plastic cover and parking their squad vehicles. I waited patiently, figuring it'd be maybe another hour or so. They hadn't really given us a timeline, but I could breathe a little easier, sort of. I was going back and forth between feeling empowered with my hands on the wheel and feeling like I was stuck in a metal coffin. It was so dark, and everything smelt of plastic and chemicals, like a car wash stuck in time. As the excitement died down, I paid more attention to the background sounds. I tried to filter out the various discussions from the nearby cars, and somewhere in the distance, I heard raised voices. It wasn't coming from the cars, but the officers. Whatever they were talking about, it was a heated discussion. An hour came and went, and people were getting impatient. More cars were honking. Others were yelling, demanding answers. I couldn't get my leg to stop shaking. The more I thought about getting out of there, the smaller the car felt. I was hyper-focusing on things I couldn't control. I was a little thirsty, and I was out of water. I needed to use the bathroom. I wanted to stretch my legs and go for a walk. I wanted to breathe fresh air and get that awful chemical taste out of my mouth. I heard cars starting, accelerating. The truck was moving somewhere off to the side. We need you to stay in your vehicle. A voice screamed over the megaphone. Do not leave for any reason. Stay in in your vehicle. Cars speeding off. Not many, but a couple. Then quiet. The officers left us there. Everyone was quiet. A couple of folks had opened up their phones, using them as flashlights to look from car to car. Looking out at the sea of vehicles, all of us trapped under that dark cover. I could see a handful of lights cut off by sharp silhouettes. I couldn't make out who was who in the dark. It was all just people. Anonymous. I heard a gasp somewhere in the back. There was a metallic clunk, like when the officers climbed atop our cars to get us our water. There was a careful cheer as some folks figured they were taking off the plastic cover. But that wasn't it. Instead, there were more footsteps. The cheers slowly died down as more and more footsteps pattered across our cars. I stopped counting after a dozen. The silhouettes in the other cars were still. We all held our breaths, waiting for an answer to show itself. What the hell was going on? What was that sound? Somewhere off to my right, I heard a voice. "Who's up there?" It sounded like an older man. I'd seen a pickup truck that way earlier. Almost as a response, the footsteps stopped. There was a faint clicking sound like someone snapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Click, click. And from further away, a click in response. From somewhere to my left, another couple clicks. Then, a cascade of clicks. Dozens, maybe hundreds. There was an awful metallic noise coming from my right. Then, breaking glass. A scream cut short, followed by several irregular taps of the car horn. One of the silhouettes in the distance turned into a blur as something passed through the windshield, cutting through the plastic cover. Somewhere in the front row, the roof of a car was cut wide open. Someone was pulled up out of their seat. 2 cars back from where I was, there was more glass breaking. It sounded like a wild animal got in. I could see a weak hint of red spattered against the passenger side windows. I wasn't getting any air. I could feel my heart beating through my chest as my arms started shaking. My hands were cramped around the steering wheel, and I felt sweat dripping down my shoulders. I couldn't control it. I didn't even see what was going on, but these sounds, these screams, they awakened something primal. This was danger, a threat. My body knew long before I did. The college kids in the other car were ducking down. One of them waved a hand at me, as if telling me to get down. I nodded. I scrambled into the back seat. I couldn't see where I was putting my hands or my feet. Everything is different in the dark. As I tumbled my way over, my foot accidentally tapped the car horn. It was a quick tap, a fraction of a second. But to me, it was the loudest sound in the world. I was lying on my stomach in the back seat, and within seconds, something heavy climbed onto the hood of my car. I could feel the car buckling. It was much heavier than the man who'd passed out water bottles. I held my hands in front of my mouth to stop the panting, but I just ended up snorting up sweat instead. My nose stung as I bit my tongue, listening to every metallic groan as whatever was outside moved and shifted. Click, click. And from behind my car, a click in response. There were no lights being held up anymore. Everyone was cowering, going quiet. I pushed myself up against the door behind the driver's seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the frame of the car complain as something slowly moved. When it came to my sunroof, there was a slight crack. That made it stop. Another crack. I silently shook my head, as if trying to ask the car to stop. That thing was going to break. And it did. My legs were showered with glass as a big blob of plastic cover dipped into my car. Something big came tumbling into the front seat, still covered in protective plastic. It twitched and spun around, its clicking turning from a careful question-like noise to a never-ending barrage. It was calling for help, alerting others, and it was cutting its way through the plastic. There were footsteps coming from every direction, some of them leaping from car to car, some of them leaping far enough to skip a car as they hurried. I was going to be swarmed within seconds. I fumbled with my hands, accidentally cutting my thumb on the broken glass. I managed to open the passenger side door, but even at its widest, and even when pressing into the college kid's car, it wasn't enough room to get out. Still, I had to try. I pressed myself into the gap and exhaled as much as I could, flattening my chest. While the thing thrashed around inside my car, I could feel my vision going faint. Black spots popped up at the edge of my vision. My arms were going weak, and yet by some miracle I made it through. As my face hit the gravel of the makeshift parking lot, I felt the burn of residual chemicals. I swallowed my instinct to run, instead staying on my stomach. forcing myself to crawl under my car. There were more of them, some climbing on, some off. My chest was pressed to the ground as the weight shifted. I heard breaking glass from the windshield and tearing fabric. Something was stuck up there, and it was furious, like a trapped animal. I could hear the college kids mumbling to one another, trying to stay calm. One assuring the other that all they had to do was stay low, stay quiet, and wait. Then, something slammed into the passenger side door, the one I'd crawled out of. The door was pressed up against the neighboring car, then fell haphazardly to the ground, completely off the hinges. An ink-black, bird-like foot touched the ground right next to me. I've looked it up since. There were 3 toes forward, 1 toe backward, all clawed. Anisotile feet, similar to that of many birds of prey, except larger than a human foot and with smooth, oil-slick skin. It must have been heavy, at least 400 pounds. If the clicking noise came from its mouth, I can approximate that it was somewhere around 6'7" to 6'9". Or taller, it could have been hunched over. How it managed to walk in the gap between the vehicles is beyond me, but I suspect it was very thin. It daintily walked from my car to the others, as if scanning for something. I could barely see anything in the dark, but this thing seemed to navigate it perfectly. It didn't bump into anything. There was a tap on the glass of the car behind me, to my right, and someone got startled. A short scream, and the hunt was on. This time was different. It must have caused some kind of chain reaction, as all of a sudden the plastic cover was getting torn up left and right. People were clawing their way out of their cars. I heard someone kicking against their windshield. Another was trying to open their door. I could hear it slamming against the side of the car next to them. And off in the distance, there was gunfire. Just a couple of shots. The college kids in the car next to me slammed their doors open and followed my lead. They rolled onto the ground and under their car. There was a little more light coming in as the cover had been torn above. Their faces were red from tears, and one of them was desperately trying to call for help on his phone. The other grabbed the phone out of his hand. A short scuffle ensued, ending with them putting on a ringtone and sliding the thing as far to the left as they could. Whatever car that phone landed under was demolished. Every window broken. Every passenger gone. I could hear the grinding as a seat was ripped in two and thrown away. In a matter of seconds, an entire vehicle was torn to pieces as a dozen of those things swarmed it. "Shut up," one of the college kids repeated. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Something reached under my car. It scraped against the sole of my shoe, tearing a hole all the way to my big toe. I hurried forward, scurrying like a lizard. The college kids noticed and followed suit. I don't think they thought about it too much. It was just movement, and they went for it. I made it 2 cars down before I got stuck. There was something dark in the way, and I couldn't get around it without exposing myself. I couldn't see what it was, but it didn't take long for me to figure it out. There was a meaty crunch, as if someone was biting chunks out of a piece of meat. It was struggling to get through the fabric of their clothes, making a snapping noise as threads gave way. A pool of blood rolled under the car, staining the tip of my fingers. It was still warm. One of those things were eating a victim. I hunkered down, trying to remember to breathe. And I stayed there, waiting for a chance. Any chance. I must have stayed there for at least an hour, hearing every bite. Every crack of bone and snap of sinew. Satisfied clicking noises. As it finished its meal, it wandered off, dragging the remains along. They were moving forward. Something heavy walked over the car I was hiding under, dragging a body along. Slowly, the footsteps disappeared. It was quiet again, and in that quiet, I found my footing. I made my way to the edge of the plastic cover. I listened one final time, pushed one of the weights away, and slipped through. They were gone, and I was out. I could feel my chest growing lighter, allowing me to breathe. I wanted to cry from relief. A breeze was picking up, drying the sweat on my brow and carrying the smell of grass. Stepping back, I turned towards the sea of cars to see how bad the damage was. And then I saw one. It was a bit off to the side, perching on top of an old Honda. At a glance, it looked like a tall person, covered in a slick black ink. But looking closer, you could see the strange bird-like feet, the pointed nails, the long row of shark-like teeth on a mouth that was far too wide. I froze. The thing rose to its full length, easily over 7 feet tall. It looked ready to pounce on me. I had nothing to defend myself with. I couldn't make any sudden moves. I wouldn't even be halfway under the car before that thing would be over me. 100 thoughts raced through my mind, but there was nothing I could do. I was out of options, but the thing just looked at me. It raised a slice of raw meat. Blood dripped onto the plastic cover. It looked at me curiously, taking a bite. Then, as if nothing had happened, it wandered off, satiated. I was left there, shaking like a dry leaf. And with the last of those things gone, all that was left was the panic. It didn't take long for the officers to return. The plastic cover was removed, but we couldn't go home. Not after this. Some folks signed a waiver and were let go immediately. They weren't allowed to talk about what they'd seen, and in return, they'd get a hefty sum of insurance money. Others demanded answers and were taken into custody for obstruction of justice. A few others still were too panicked to make any kind of sense and had to be checked out by medical personnel. A total of 14 people died. It was described by a combination of causes: a traffic pileup, carbon monoxide poisoning, animal attack. I think there was something about an escaped convict too. Excuses all over the place, and the times were all wrong, spread out through a couple of days to more smoothly blend into accident statistics. And if you wanted to go home and get your insurance money, you had to sign a non-disclosure. I did too. I know the college kids did as well. Miracle they made it out, but I saw them. 34 cars had to be towed. 18 people wounded, 6 seriously so. 4 people lost at least one limb. One guy had an arm ripped off halfway up his collarbone. I don't know how he survived. Most people never saw those things up close. They just remember the screams and the breaking glass. Sometimes at night, that's all I hear too. Closing my eyes reminds me of lying under those cars, feeling the pressure as the weight shifted. I still get trouble breathing. I think a part of me is still stuck there. It stayed in my vehicle. I had moved to the neighborhood looking for a fresh start. Just me, my cat, and the quiet, suburban streets. After the breakup, I needed to get away from everything familiar, the echoes of the past that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The house I found was a modest one, with white trim and a small garden, nestled in a tree-lined street where every house looked like it belonged in a picture frame. The kind of place that whispered, peaceful and safe. I thought it would be just the thing to help me recover, but I should have known that sometimes peace comes with a price. My first few days were mostly uneventful. I unpacked, arranged the furniture in the living room, and wandered around the neighborhood, taking in the quiet, the stillness. That's when I first met Sarah. She lived in the house next door, a large, well-maintained property with a garden that looked like something out of a magazine. I noticed her in the driveway, bent over, pruning her roses. Her smile was wide, almost too wide, and she looked up at me like she'd been waiting for me. "Hi, you must be Megan, the new neighbor." Her voice was bubbly, warm, with just a touch of forced enthusiasm. "I'm Sarah. I live next door." I smiled, figuring I had just met someone who was genuinely friendly. She invited me over for coffee the next day, and we spent hours talking. At first, I enjoyed the conversation. It was nice to have someone to talk to, especially since the quiet of the house started to feel a bit too overwhelming. Sarah was in her 30s, with a perpetual air of cheerfulness that, at the time, felt comforting. She told me about her life, her job, and how she'd been living in the neighborhood for years. She also mentioned how she enjoyed meeting new people, which seemed to explain why she was so eager to chat. As days went by, Sarah's visits became more frequent. She showed up uninvited sometimes, just to check in or bring over a casserole or flowers. I didn't mind at first. It was a small town after all, and I figured she was just a friendly, helpful person. But slowly, I began to feel something shift, like a weight pressing down on me. I felt smothered, like I couldn't breathe without her there, hovering, always wanting to be part of my life. I remember one evening, after a long day of unpacking, I finally settled into the couch with a glass of wine. I had planned to relax in silence, just me and my thoughts. But no sooner had I turned on the TV when the doorbell rang. Sarah stood there with a jar of homemade jam, her smile wide as ever. "I thought you might like this," she said, holding the jar out to me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I made it this morning. You're the new neighbor after all. I just wanted to make sure you feel welcome." I took the jar, and for a moment, I felt guilty for feeling irritated. But deep down, something told me that Sarah wasn't just being friendly. There was something about her that didn't sit right. I smiled politely and invited her in for a few minutes, but the whole time I felt like I was being watched. It was like she was studying me, reading me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer just a neighbor to her. I was something else, something she wanted to keep close, like a possession. As Sarah left that night, I watched her walk back to her house with her usual purposeful stride. And that was when I first noticed something odd. Her house, despite being so meticulously kept, felt off. It was too perfect, too clean, like it was a facade she was desperately trying to maintain. Even the curtains in her windows were always drawn, as if to keep the world from looking inside. I didn't know why, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Something about Sarah, something about the way she had inserted herself into my life, didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The days dragged on, and Sarah's presence became a constant in my life. At first, I had thought her sudden appearances were just the quirks of a lonely person, someone who wanted to make sure I felt at home. But as time passed, her behavior started to seem more calculated, deliberate. There was an intensity to her actions now, a kind of fixation that I couldn't ignore. I'd be in the middle of a quiet evening, reading or watching TV, and there she was again, standing at my door with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd bring little gifts, always something that seemed just a bit too personal. Candles that smelled exactly like the ones I'd mentioned liking, or new plants for my windowsill. Each gift, each visit, felt like a subtle intrusion into my space. The weirdest part was how she always seemed to know exactly when I needed her. It wasn't that I'd called for her or even asked for anything. But no matter what, Sarah always showed up when things were quietest. The times when I should have been left to my own thoughts, she'd come knocking, wanting to chat, or simply stand in the doorway and watch me. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. I had just reached the end of the block when I noticed Sarah's house again. There was something about the windows that caught my attention. They weren't just closed, as I'd thought before. They were sealed tight, like something inside had to stay hidden. I tried to ignore the thought, but my curiosity kept tugging at me. The next day, I found myself standing outside Sarah's house, staring up at the large, square windows. It was a beautiful house, but there was something unsettling about the way it stood there, almost too perfect. The front door was always locked, and the windows always closed, no matter the time of day. I never saw anyone come or go, except for Sarah. I had a strange thought then. Maybe she wasn't just hiding something. Maybe she was hiding herself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the sound of Sarah's quiet laughter echoing in my mind. She always laughed like everything was fine, like nothing was wrong, but there was something in her eyes, a darkness that never quite matched the brightness of her smile. I finally decided to investigate. It wasn't a rational decision, but I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. I waited until midnight, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The moonlight filtered in through the curtains, casting shadows on the walls. I grabbed my coat, telling myself that I was just going for a walk, nothing more. But as I stood by my front door, a sense of urgency flooded over me. Something told me that tonight would be different. I took a deep breath and walked across the street, careful not to make any noise. The house looked even darker now, its windows like blank eyes watching me as I approached. The quietness of the neighborhood pressed in on me, and I felt as if I were doing something wrong, something I couldn't take back. But the pull was too strong. I had to know what was inside. I crept around the side of Sarah's house, moving slowly to avoid being seen. There was a narrow path leading to the back, overgrown with ivy and weeds. I felt my heart race as I reached the back door, which stood slightly ajar. I had no idea why she would leave it open, but it didn't matter. I slipped inside. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been opened to the air in years. I made my way through the dark hallway, trying not to make a sound. The air grew colder the further I went, and the walls seemed to close in on me. My fingers brushed over the wallpaper, rough and old, as I made my way down the hall toward the stairs. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I pressed on. The house felt wrong, and I had to find out why. As I crept further into Sarah's house, the silence pressed against me like a living thing. Each step was a gamble. Would the floor creak? Would she hear me? But the house remained eerily still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The light from the hallway barely reached the stairs as I ascended, one hand gripping the railing for support. Every inch of this place felt like it was suffocating me, but I couldn't turn back now. The second floor was just as unsettling as the first. The hall was narrow, with rooms that stretched back into darkness. I tiptoed past each door, peering into the rooms as I went. The first few were empty, save for a few pieces of antique furniture, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creep in as I moved further down the hall. Then I came to a door that was slightly ajar, and I froze. The room beyond was a study of some sort, shelves crammed with books I didn't recognize and old photographs pinned to the walls. But it wasn't the books or the photos that stopped me in my tracks. No, it was the smell, the pungent, metallic odor that filled the air. Something sharp and unpleasant. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but it made my stomach turn. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was too quiet, but then I heard it. The faintest whisper like a breath on the wind. The sound came from behind one of the large cabinets. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled open the cabinet door, revealing a small, hidden space behind it. I gasped. There, in the dim light, were dozens of photos pinned to the wall. Each photo was of me, taken from various angles from different times, and the thing that chilled me to my core was how she'd captured me in places I thought were private. At my window, in my backyard, walking down the street. There was even one where I was laughing at the coffee shop, completely unaware that I was being watched. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How had she gotten these? How long had she been watching me? The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I could barely breathe as I looked at the photos, each one a silent testament to her obsession. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. How could someone do this? And then I heard it again. The sound of whispering, soft but growing louder. It came from beneath the floorboards, an eerie scraping sound, like something scratching against wood. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I had to get out. This was too much. But then something caught my eye. A door, almost hidden in the corner of the room, was cracked open just enough to reveal a dim light coming from within. My feet moved before my brain could stop them, and I found myself walking toward the door. I had to know what was behind it. What had Sarah been hiding? I pushed the door open. The basement stairs loomed before me, a dark, narrow passage that seemed to drop into the earth itself. The air was thick with the smell of dampness, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, but then I heard the sound again. The whispering, the scraping, but now it was louder, more frantic. I had no choice. I had to see it for myself. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, the darkness swallowing me whole. Each step took me deeper into the pit, and the farther I went, the more the atmosphere shifted. It was as though the very air in the basement was charged with something electric, something wrong. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up, and my breath came in shallow gasps. At the bottom of the stairs, the dim light revealed a room. Small, cramped, with a low ceiling. In the center of the room, a large metal cage sat against the far wall, and inside it I saw something. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. A grotesque figure, half human, half beast, lay in the cage, its eyes wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. The creature's skin was pale and stretched thin, its body covered in patchy, matted hair. It hissed at me, a sound so chilling that I almost stumbled backward in fear. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing, but it was impossible. The whispering, the scratching, all of it had led me here. To this creature, this monstrosity that Sarah had been keeping. And then I heard her voice, soft and calm, as if nothing were wrong. "You shouldn't have come down here, Megan." I froze, my breath caught in my throat as Sarah's voice echoed in the small basement. My body felt like stone, unable to move. How long had she been standing there watching me? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature in the cage, its eyes still fixed on me, its presence suffocating the air. The tension between Sarah and me felt thick, unbearable, like the moment before a storm breaks. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, her face calm, almost serene. There was no hint of panic or surprise in her expression, as though she had expected me to find this place all along. Her eyes were locked onto mine, but they were different. Cold, calculating, like the eyes of a predator watching its prey. "I knew you'd find it eventually," she said, her voice soft, almost like she was trying to soothe me. You always had to go snooping around, didn't you? Why? I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. Why are you doing this? What is that thing? Sarah's smile never wavered. She stepped closer, her shoes tapping softly against the concrete floor, but her eyes never left mine. You wouldn't understand, Megan. You never did, but that's okay. She gestured toward the creature in the cage, her hand sweeping through the air like she was presenting a masterpiece. This is my family. This is what I've been working toward. I shook my head, the words not making sense, yet they rang in my ears with a chilling clarity. Your family? That thing is not a family, Sarah. It's a monster. Her expression darkened for a moment, the smile faltering before it returned more controlled. A monster? She repeated, her voice low and full of amusement. No, it's not a monster. It's a gift. It's something ancient, something powerful. I've been taking care of it for years. Feeding it, nurturing it, keeping it hidden, waiting for the right time. She paused, her gaze flicking briefly toward the creature in the cage. And now, Megan, it's time for you to join us. The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke. The creature in the cage let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing as it shifted, restless. I could feel its gaze on me, as if it were weighing my very soul. My stomach churned, a mixture of fear and disgust flooding me. Join you, I repeated, my voice trembling. What do you mean by that? What have you done to me? Sarah's smile widened. I've been watching you for months, Megan. I've been studying you, learning about you. Every little detail. Your habits, your fears, your weaknesses. Her eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity. You're perfect. You're exactly what we need. I took a step back, my mind racing to make sense of everything. What are you talking about? You're insane. Sarah's expression hardened, her patience clearly wearing thin. No, Megan, you just don't understand yet. You will. You'll see what I've been building. You'll see how perfect everything is once you become part of the family. I glanced at the creature, my heart sinking in my chest. It was no longer just a terrifying figure in a cage. It was part of this twisted reality Sarah had created. My thoughts spiraled, fear clawing at my insides. I needed to get out of here. I had to escape before it was too late. Listen to me, Sarah, I said, my voice shaking with desperation. You're sick. You need help. You can't keep doing this. You can't. Before I could finish my sentence, Sarah raised a hand, silencing me. Her gaze flickered to the creature in the cage again, and then back to me. You think I'm sick, Megan. You think this is wrong. You don't even know what real power is. This creature. It's not just a pet. It's a part of me, part of my purpose, and soon you'll be too. The room seemed to close in on me. I needed a plan, a way out, but my mind was spinning. There was no way I could take Sarah on by myself. Not with that thing in the cage, watching me like a hawk. I glanced around, looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing but old furniture and shelves of junk. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, the pressure building as Sarah's words sank in. Please, Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Let me go. I won't tell anyone. Just let me leave. Her smile twisted into something darker, more calculating. I can't let you go, Megan. Not now. Not when you're so close to understanding. You'll be a part of this family, whether you want to be or not. With a sudden movement, she stepped forward, reaching for me. But before she could grab me, the creature in the cage let out an ear-splitting screech, causing both Sarah and me to freeze in place. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked at the cage, only to find the bars rattling, the creature's form shifting violently inside. It was no longer in its cage. It had broken free. The basement door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through my veins as I turned to face the door, desperately pushing against it with my hands. But the door was locked. There was no way out. My breath quickened, and I could hear Sarah's footsteps moving closer, her shadow creeping up behind me like an inescapable nightmare. I spun around, my pulse racing, searching for any way to defend myself. The creature, no, the thing, was out of its cage. It was no longer the grotesque, motionless shape that I had seen earlier. Now it was a hulking, deformed figure, its movements jerky, but with an unnatural speed. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, and its eyes burned with a predatory hunger. It was as if the air itself had turned toxic, thick with a sense of malice that crawled under my skin. Sarah, I gasped, my voice trembling with terror. "What the hell have you done?" She didn't respond. Her cold, emotionless stare locked onto me, and I saw the faintest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "It's beautiful, isn't it? You're starting to understand now, Megan. This is all part of the plan." The creature took another step forward, its claws scraping against the concrete floor. It was almost to me. My heart hammered against my chest as I stumbled back, desperate to create distance between us. I scanned the room frantically, my mind struggling to form a coherent thought. My eyes landed on a rusted pipe near the far wall, and instinct kicked in. I rushed toward it, grabbing the pipe with both hands and pulling it free from the wall. My grip tightened around the cold metal as I turned back to face Sarah and the creature. The thing was now almost on top of me, its eyes glowing with hunger. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I raised the pipe, ready to defend myself, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to stop it. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice raw with fear, though I wasn't sure who I was warning. Sarah or the creature. "I'll fight you, I swear." Sarah didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed to enjoy my panic. "You can't fight it, Megan. You're too weak. You've always been weak." The creature lunged, its powerful legs propelling it toward me faster than I could react. I swung the pipe, but it was too slow. The creature knocked it from my hands with ease, sending it crashing to the ground. It let out a growl, the sound vibrating through my bones. I scrambled backward, my heart racing. This was it. There was no way out, no way to survive. The creature's breath was hot and foul, its claws glinting in the dim light. I could feel the floor beneath me tremble as it stalked closer, its body bending unnaturally as it moved. I knew I had mere seconds before it reached me. But then, a voice. Sarah's voice, cut through the chaos. "Enough." The creature froze in place. I turned to look at Sarah, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. She stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an almost eerie intensity. Her voice, though calm, was filled with a strange, commanding authority. "Go back to the cage," Sarah said, her tone low but filled with power. "Now." I watched in shock as the creature hesitated, its movements slowing, as if it was processing her command. And then, just as suddenly as it had charged toward me, it turned away, moving back toward the cage, its massive body shifting with unnatural grace. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Why did it listen to you?" Sarah smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that sent chills down my spine. "I've spent years training it. It listens to me because it knows I am its creator. I am the one who has given it life. And now, it's time for you to join us." I shook my head, disbelief mixing with dread. "No, Sarah, I won't. I'll never join you." Sarah's eyes darkened. "You don't have a choice, Megan. You never did." Before I could respond, she stepped forward, closing the distance between us. She raised her hand, and I felt a sharp, sudden pain shoot through my chest. I gasped, my knees buckling beneath me as I staggered back. It was as if her very presence was suffocating me, draining me of my strength. "You'll be just like the others," she murmured, her voice like ice. "A part of my family. Forever." With everything I had left, I staggered to my feet. I had to get out. I couldn't let Sarah win. But as I turned to make a run for the stairs, I was stopped dead in my tracks by a sudden force that pinned me to the floor. The creature had come back. It was standing above me, its massive, clawed hands pressing me down, its face inches from mine. I could feel its breath on my skin, hot and rancid, as its teeth glinted in the dim light. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling, "don't." But it didn't listen. It didn't need to. The last thing I heard was Sarah's voice, soft and satisfied. "It's over, Megan. You're mine now." I closed my eyes, knowing that there was no escape. The darkness swallowed me whole. I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps, my body aching as if it had been beaten into submission. My head throbbed and my vision was blurred. The oppressive weight on my chest made it difficult to breathe, but I pushed through, forcing my eyes open. The room around me was dim, but I could make out the shapes of the basement walls, the same ones I had been in earlier. The creature was gone. I slowly sat up, disoriented, my hands reaching out for anything to steady myself. My mind struggled to piece together the events that had led to this moment. Sarah had been there, the creature, the overwhelming terror that had nearly consumed me. How had I survived? I looked around and realized I was alone. The basement was eerily silent now. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, but it wasn't as thick as before. My heart was still racing, and fear gnawed at my insides, but there was no time to dwell on it. The door to the basement creaked open, and I froze. I expected Sarah to walk in, but instead it was someone else. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's uniform. His eyes widened when he saw me sitting on the floor, dazed but alive. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but filled with concern. He rushed over to me, kneeling down to help me up. "We got the call. You're safe now." "The call," I croaked, my throat dry. "What happened? Where's Sarah? The creature? What happened to it?" The sheriff didn't answer right away, but his face grew darker. He helped me stand, guiding me to the stairs. "Let's get you out of here first. We'll talk once you're out of this place." I followed him, the weight of my exhaustion bearing down on me with each step. The stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended, and the further we climbed, the less I could feel the presence of Sarah. The fear that had gripped me now felt like a distant memory. When we reached the top of the stairs, I looked around, expecting to see more officers or evidence of the chaos I'd experienced. But there was nothing. The house was quiet, too quiet. "Where is everyone?" I asked, confusion creeping into my voice. "They're clearing the house," the sheriff replied, his expression grim. "Sarah's gone. We've already taken care of the creature. It won't hurt anyone again." I shook my head, disbelief settling in my stomach. "You killed it?" He nodded slowly. "It wasn't alive the way you or I are. What Sarah had created. It wasn't human. It was a thing that shouldn't have been allowed to live." "But how did you know?" I asked, still reeling. "How did you find us?" The sheriff hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "We'd been investigating Sarah for a while. We had our suspicions, but no one could have imagined the full extent of her obsession. When we got the tip-off, we moved fast." "Who tipped you off?" I pressed, my mind racing to make sense of everything. "That's something you don't need to worry about right now," he said, avoiding my gaze. "What matters is that you're safe. We've got everything under control." But I wasn't sure that was true. The fear hadn't left me entirely. Something still didn't sit right. I hadn't just been a victim in this twisted game. Something deeper, darker, was at play. "You said Sarah was gone," I whispered. "But what does that mean? Is she—" "She's been arrested," the sheriff interrupted, his voice hardening. "But that doesn't explain what she was really up to. There's more to this than just one obsessed woman. We'll get to the bottom of it." The sheriff's words barely made sense to me, but the tension in the room was palpable. He led me to the front door, where I could see the flashing lights of police cars parked outside, casting their harsh glow across the yard. Officers were moving in and out of the house, taking notes and collecting evidence. I could feel my legs giving way beneath me, but the sheriff steadied me, helping me into a waiting patrol car. As the door closed behind me, I sank back into the seat, the weight of everything that had happened pressing on me. "I think I may die in this Airbnb. I don't know where my friends are. I don't even know where I am. None of us would have been able to afford this on our own. Even with 5 of us, it was still pricey. But to be fair, it was one hell of a house. It was 3 stories with dark scallop siding. Paul had grown up in the area and had found the place. He'd heard all sorts of things about the place being haunted, and some of the dark history growing up, but it hadn't been open to the public back then. When we chose this town as our friendcation destination, he jumped at the chance to stay here. I was intrigued, but the prospect of staying somewhere haunted excited me a lot less than it did my friends. From the moment we walked in, Ada and I seemed to both pick up on vibes that unnerved us. As Katie, Diane, and Paul went room to room looking around excitedly, we both hung back and hovered closer to the front door. The house was beautiful, yes, but in a foreboding sort of way. The dark wood and stained glass windows meant that very little light truly filtered in, even in the peak daylight hours. The old floorboards protested our friends' steps as they explored the house. A door off to the side of the kitchen caught my attention, and I found myself drawn to it. Inside was a staircase. It was narrow and incredibly steep. You could only see a few steps before it rose out of our sight completely. It looked old, and to be honest, terrifying. "Sight the Ada, want to join the tour?" Paul shouted down to us. Paul guided us around like an expert and shared trivia about the house. Even though he claimed he had never been here before, he talked about the place like it was an old friend. He was the newest one to our friend group, so I had only known him a few months. But this was the most excited I had ever seen him. He was almost giddy. The house was large enough for each of us to have our own room. I wasn't excited about that. The last thing my overactive imagination and I needed were a giant room to myself. Just my eyes began to close that night. I thought I heard something move along the floor above me. It sounded like something large and wet and was being dragged along the floor. No, not being passively dragged. It was crawling. I could hear a faint mournful sighing sound through the grate on the wall. I turned on my phone and listened to some music to drown it out. It sounded like it was moaning now. I turned the music up louder, covered my head with a blanket. I burrowed my headphones into my ears deep enough to cause future hearing loss. If you can't hear it, it can't hurt you, right? Somehow, I did manage to fall asleep. I asked the others if they had had any odd experiences. It was just me. Paul looked excited. He had lots of questions. He truly was hoping the house was haunted. I just told him I heard footsteps. I felt like that made me sound less crazy than if I said I heard something crying out in the night. He looked at me with a sly smile, almost as if he knew I was lying. We spent the day in town and had an amazing time. Katie asked around about the house we were staying in. An older man at a little ice cream shop we visited told us he thought it was irresponsible and dangerous to rent the place out after what had happened there. It turns out a number of tragedies occurred there, from as recent as the owners before our Airbnb host, and then dating back to nearly 200 years earlier. He mentioned how he believed that enough suffering could result in opening a door and letting something in. "So you do think it's haunted?" Diane asked, her green eyes wide. She had been hanging on to the man's every word. "Well, I always thought haunted implied that a human passed on but never left." He scratched his chin, leaned in for effect. "But I don't think what walks those halls was ever human." His words hovered over me the rest of the day like a dark cloud. The sounds from upstairs continued on the second night. The wet slaps, followed by slow drags and cries above me, sickened me. I mentally nicknamed whatever was making those sounds the crawler, and immediately regretted it because giving it a name did not quell my fears. Damn my overactive imagination. I turned music on again. I woke up around midnight and the album had ended, but luckily so had the disturbing sounds from upstairs. I heard voices coming from the living room area and figured I'd see if my friends were also being kept up too. There wasn't anyone there. It wasn't like I had just missed them in this house. The creaky floor would have indicated their movement. I tried to quietly slide back to my room, my socks gliding across the smooth wooden floors. Not too long after I had closed the door, someone gently rapped their knuckles on my door. It was as if they had been steps behind me the whole time. But why hadn't I heard them then? "Can I come in?" Katie whispered. I was so relieved the house was really getting to me, and I was grateful for the company. Before I could even answer, she repeated herself in a more sing-songy voice. "Can I come in? I want to show you something." She called out my name, but struggled to pronounce it, like she'd never said it before. I froze. Sure, my name may not be all that common here, but we'd known each other for a decade. She always pronounced it with ease. At my lack of response, it sounded like she was pawing at the door. She let out a sound reminiscent of a wounded animal. I turned all the lights on in the room, and I spent the rest of my sleepless night trying to figure out how to tell my friends I wasn't going to spend another night here. I would still pay my portion, of course, but I was going to be staying in town tomorrow night. I smiled to myself at the thought. Yep, staying in town tomorrow. In a hotel. I'd have to use some of my savings, but it'd be worth it. The next morning, Paul stared at me, transfixed. "Hey," he leaned towards me. "What was up with you last night?" "Huh?" "You came to my door. You kept trying to get me to come to the basement with you. Remember?" I had never gone to Paul's room. I was too busy with my own ordeal. Ada and Diane had similar stories. When they came down, one of us came to their room and said something along the lines of, "Have you seen the basement yet? Let me show you," and tried to lead them down there. None of us opened the door. Diana, because she was tired and not in the mood to socialize. Paul, because he didn't know me that well and thought I was acting strange. Ada, like me, had the feeling that the visitor at her door was not one of us. Paul and Diana were excited by this seeming confirmation that our Airbnb was haunted. Ada stared at me, her face grim. As for Katie, well, she never came to breakfast at all. We had plans, and when by noon Katie still hadn't come downstairs, I volunteered to check on her. I ascended the stairs, taking in the unique features of the house. Instead of an open space in the atrium on the third floor, there was a beautiful stained glass window, placed horizontally. On the roof parallel was a skylight where the sunlight filtered through. It cast red and purple swatches of light on the floor below. I had never seen anything like it before. I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to you, but Katie wasn't in her room. I heard steps above me on the third floor. I was much braver in the light of day, so I ascended the second flight of stairs and went room to room on the third floor. No one was there, but it was cold, much colder than the second or first floors. I went back to the second floor, trying to fight the urge to glance over my shoulder. I paused in front of the door of the room above mine, where I'd heard the crawling and mournful wail the past 2 nights. I considered it for a moment and decided to open it. It was locked. Part of me was relieved. While I was upstairs, our friends had checked around the grounds. The only places they hadn't checked was the basement and whatever was up the stairs in the kitchen. We had regrouped in the kitchen and stared at the dark, steep stairs. Paul said he'd check the basement. If one of us could please take the kitchen stairs, the tight space made him nervous, he said. It seemed like a fair trade. After a moment of awkward silence, Diane volunteered, to my immense relief. She was also the smallest of us, at a petite 5'1". Even then, she still had to crawl on her hands and knees to ascend the stairs. We waited, heard her walk around above us, calling out for Katie. She was up there for a while. It sounded like the space was massive. My stomach dropped as I realized I heard 2 pairs of footsteps, one above my head and another further into the kitchen, but moving towards the person above me. Diane. I hissed up the stairs frantically. No answer. I took a deep breath and prepared to ascend after her. Just as I had crawled up about 3 steps, someone moved to stand at the top, blocking the already limited light. "We're coming," Diane whispered. She had begun to crawl towards me, descending the steep stairs, facing me, but on her hands and knees. Her arms looked long, too long, in order to allow her to do so. She propelled herself towards me using those long, thin limbs. Her eyes glinted at me in the dim light. I yelped and took a backwards leap and nearly hit my head on the doorframe. I instinctively stood behind the tallest person in the kitchen, Ada, who had a couple of inches on me. Diane emerged. She was walking, like a normal bipedal person. I must have imagined what I saw in the darkness. "Well," Paul asked, "was Katie up there?" Diane cracked her neck on each side, stared and smiled at each of us, like she was taking in each of our faces for the first time. She shook her head slowly. She gave me a smile unlike the one she flashed at Paul and Ada. She winked at me. She smelled of old things. She looked disheveled and walked stiffly. We looked around. The thing is, there was no door to the basement that we could find. Ada sent what we hoped was a nonchalant message that we all crafted together to the host, asking them where the basement was. We received the unsettling reply immediately. "There is no basement." Paul laughed at that. Diane smiled dreamily and stared up at the stained glass skylight. It was like she was in her own world ever since her stint up the small stairs. Ada and I looked at each other nervously. We went into town to see if anyone had seen Katie and spent the rest of the day searching for her. We sat together in silence. The large living room felt emptier with Katie missing. We stared at a pizza that none of us felt like eating. Looked like I was spending the night here again after all. I locked my door that night. Around what had become the usual time, I heard the wet, dragging, crawling sounds upstairs. I tried to not picture what the thing making the sounds must look like. At home, I always slept with a weighted blanket on me. It made me feel safe. With just the thin sheet and old quilt, I couldn't help but feel exposed here. Around 3 a.m., I awoke to moaning and scraping outside my door. "I need your help." I tried to place the voice. It was low, but sounded female. It wasn't Ada, it wasn't Katie. It didn't sound like Diane. "It's me, Diane." I didn't reply. The cadence was also odd. The doorknob turned, quickly, aggressively. I tried to remain silent, motionless. "I need your help. My skin, it's too tight. It doesn't fit." I sat up against the headboard with my hands over my mouth, focusing on breathing as quietly as possible as it pounded at the door. Eventually, the steps faded away. The next morning, Ada looked happy. She was practically beaming. I realized that she looked different. Ada always wore her meticulously applied cat eye eyeliner and her purple lipstick, but this morning she had no makeup on. Her blue-black hair looked odd. Her bangs that were usually carefully styled and ended in a delicate point between her brows were hastily brushed off to one side. I had always admired how she presented herself and wished I had the skill and patience. She didn't look bad this morning, but she didn't look like herself either. Diane and Paul hadn't come down. "I'm going to go look for the others," I whispered. "You should look up there." Ada whispered, in the same husky foreign voice that I heard last night outside my door. She pointed to the kitchen stairs. I felt my throat tighten. "No, no, no." I shook my head quickly. She responded with a smile. I half expected her to leap at me, or follow me on my search for Paul and Diane. She didn't. Instead, she crawled back up those narrow, thin, nightmare stairs, showing the same oddly proportioned dexterity that Diane had demonstrated the day before. I knocked on Paul's door nervously. It was also locked. I continued to knock until he came to the door groggy. He seemed mildly annoyed at the intrusion. He blocked the view into his room with his body. When I told him I couldn't find Diane, he told me he'd meet me downstairs. Diane was nowhere to be found. Ada had yet to come back down from the room above the kitchen. I could hear tearing and wet chewing sounds coming from up the stairs. I locked the door wordlessly. I tried to fight back the bile rising in my throat. I tried to tell Paul we needed to leave, while it was still daylight. I didn't want to leave our friends either, but we needed to come back with more people because something terrible was going on. We were outmatched. We were probably outnumbered. Paul tried to convince me to stay. Surely there was an explanation. We couldn't take the car and leave our friends here. He looked at me accusingly. I loved our friends too, but I wasn't going to spend another night in this place. I thought of the crawler upstairs behind its locked door, dragging its heavy body across the floor like wet meat crying out in the darkness for who knows what. I thought of Diane's odd behavior and subsequent disappearance. I thought of Katie, who had a crush on Paul. If she heard his voice outside her door, I'm sure she would have followed him. I thought of the thing that was likely wearing Ada's skin, eating something messily upstairs. I vaguely wondered if Paul and I were the only ones left. I told Paul I was leaving. As I was packing up, I felt a sharp blow, and everything went dark. I woke up in the basement. Turns out there was a basement after all. Katie was down here too. She seemed to be pinned to the wall by her wrists. Her eyes were glassy. She stared ahead, unblinking, pale. "Katie," I hissed at her. She weakly turned her head to me. She was wearing the same clothes she had on 2 days ago. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. I was just relieved she was alive. I heard footsteps on the stairs. It was Paul. He was carrying an ice chest and a satchel of tools. I had never been happier to see him. He came to me, squatted by me, and patted me on the head like I was a child, beaming. "Saipti, you're awake. Great. We've still got more mouths to feed." He rubbed his hands together excitedly. There was a kind of madness in his eyes. Despite all the terrifying things I'd experienced in this house, realizing that Paul was a part of whatever was happening, was 10 times worse. The small remaining hope I had flickered out in that moment. While he fiddled with the tools, selecting something long and sharp-looking, I shifted and positioned my legs beneath me. As Paul approached me, I sprung up and ran towards him, hitting him hard with my shoulder. It seemed to take him by surprise, and I took advantage of his momentary confusion to pick up the ice chest the only way I could, with my hands bound by one handle, and swung it at him. It connected with a dull thud, and he fell backwards. I turned towards Katie. Now I could see her legs. It was as if something had been gnawing at them. I could see bone peeking through her torn jeans. I knew I'd have to come back for her later. There was no way I could move her in her current state. I ran up the stairs and my heart sunk when I found I was in a part of the house I had never seen before. It looked older, lacked the meticulous care applied to restoring and cleaning the rest of the place. I wondered which of the many doors led out, but the fact that one door was nailed shut served to both further dash my hopes and answer that question. I limped. My leg was asleep through the dusty hallway. I found a room where light seeped through 2 small windows and locked the door. I've called the police. All I can do now is wait and hope I can either get one of the sealed windows open or the police find me before Paul or one of the other residents do. The cabin wasn't located anywhere on the Airbnb app or in my travel guide. I was sure I was lost in those woods for good, but there I was, sitting on a comfy bed in a small room. The winds and rain flogged the outside of the cabin. The place wasn't big, in both size and number of rooms. There was a small living room and kitchen, hallway, bathroom, and 2 bedrooms. I was greeted by an elderly gentleman at the door who told me the storm had cut off the electricity, but that we would square up with the bill in the morning. He promised a cheap rate for the inconvenience, but I wasn't worried. I would have paid anything just to get out of that storm. The week I spent hiking in the mountains was fun, but I was ready for a roof over my head and warm running water. Taking a wash rag out of my bag, I ran water over it from the sink inside my room. That's right, there was a sink in my room. I finished washing, dropped my bag at the foot of the bed, sat on the mattress, and looked around my new sleeping quarters. There was just enough room for the bed and sink. Cozy was what the old man called it. There was a framed picture on the wall and a window overlooking the same woods I emerged from moments ago. Finding this cabin must mean that the small town I had looked up was close by. But this will do for tonight. The photo on the wall was very old, and its frame flaked slivers of wood. The photo was of a figure standing in a door frame. It was rustic looking. Perhaps it was an ancestor that built the cabin. It could also have been a hunting cabin at one time. The photo was yellow and faded. No more detail could be seen. The storm outside grew more intense. The roof and walls groaned from the storm's force, boards bowing and shingles rattling. The rhythmic sound of dripping water could be heard in my room, but not seen. The window rattled slightly from the wind. I stood and walked towards it, the weight of my footsteps forcing the floorboards to bleed with sound that seemed to echo through the walls and into the rest of the cabin. The lightning shined through the brittle glass of the window as I pulled the curtain closed. Before I could begin to count the seconds between flashes of lightning, a loud crack of energy roared through the sky. We must have been right in the middle of the storm. I walked back to my bed and sat on the edge of the springy mattress. Leaning forward, I pushed the locking pin on the bedroom doorknob and jiggled the handle softly, testing the mechanism. The handle was fastened tightly, giving heavy resistance as tried turning the knob. I leaned back onto the bed and sighed. I didn't feel unsafe, but I didn't feel safe either. Laying back into the dusty sheets, I tried getting comfortable. I couldn't help but think how I hadn't heard the old man once since I came into this room and closed the door behind me. Was he fast asleep in his room? Does he live in a different house in town and rent this whole cabin out? It dawned on me that I never even asked him about the property not being on the Airbnb app. I saw the sign outside and just assumed. I shook the eerie feeling best I could. I tried not to think about him standing, still and patient, on just the other side of the bedroom door. I pulled out my phone to see if there was another place I could rent for the night, or even a hotel, but the black void of my phone's screen informed me the battery had died. I placed the phone back in my pocket. I didn't feel like dressing down, so I just slept in my clothes. I scanned the room one more time, then shut my eyes and just tried to relax. A bright flash of lightning danced along the walls. It felt like only a couple of seconds had passed since closing my eyes. I was drenched in sweat. The feeling that time had passed began to set in. How many hours had I been asleep? The storm was still heavy and punishing. I tossed the covers off me, trying to cool off. Steam rolled off my clothes and into the chilling air. I was burning up, but the room was freezing. The curtains were still closed, but because of how thin they were, the flashes of lightning seeped through the faded silk, illuminating the room. I looked over at the door, and it was still closed, the locking pin pushed in. The rest of the house seemed quiet. A glare from the moon reflected off the picture's glass, creating a glowing illusion. I wasn't sure how the moon could shine through the storm clouds. The image of a doorway, and the figure it surrounds, appeared faded still, if not more than before. I checked my phone again, hoping it somehow magically charged, but the reflection of my hopeful face was all that stared back at me. I pulled the bed sheets up to my neck, leaving the thick winter blanket at my feet. Closing my eyes, I hoped to pass a few more hours. Maybe the storm would be done soon and I could leave a little early. I'd leave a note with my information and just pay the gentleman later. Just as I finished that thought, crash, I awoke again, but this time to the sound of glass breaking. Thunder roared and I shot up in bed. The picture frame had fallen off the wall. The sides of the house shook violently as the wind relentlessly squalled. The picture frame rested on the floor, leaning against the wall. Oddly enough, the glass only shattered around the doorway in the picture where the figure stood. I looked around the room. The door and window appeared closed, as were the curtains. I looked back at the photo, and two dimly lit eyes stared back. Boom, a crackle of thunder screamed from outside. But when I looked back at the photo, nothing was out of place. It lay broken in the dark. My mind was beginning to play tricks on me. I decided to stay awake until sunrise. I didn't want to sleep anymore. I listened for the elderly gentleman to come check on the sound of the picture falling, but all I could hear was the sound of rushing rain, creaking boards, and rustling trees. Boom and thunder. The bed sheets were soaked in sweat. The itchy fabric of the heavy winter blanket scratched my socks. The town was only a 10 or 20-minute jog from here. I thought about running through the storm. But thinking logically, I could have headed the wrong way, deeper into the woods. I compared the feeling I have now, sitting in this creepy room, to the feeling I might have if I came across a bear or pack of wolves in the dark forest. At least in here, I won't be torn to shreds. Boom. I was shaking, so cold I might as well have been outside. Though I was sweating like I had a fever. I grabbed the winter blanket and draped it over my lap. I wasn't sure how much I had slept, but sunrise should have only been a few hours away. Though I wouldn't know if this storm continues so heavily. I slowly began to warm up. Refusing to lay down again, I leaned against the cold wall of the bedroom. I don't even remember closing my eyes when I woke up, sweating and hot again. This time I was lying on my side, facing the door. I felt nauseated, almost dehydrated. The storm was worse now than it had been all night. The lightning flashed through the tattered curtains, and I noticed immediately that the bedroom door is wide open. Boom! Thunder shook the cabin. Sweat dripped off my nose, but I couldn't uncover myself. Frozen with fear, I stared into the darkness outside the door. Lightning flashed, but beyond the door frame was pitch black. In this position, I couldn't see the window, but I could see the picture frame. I darted my eyes between the empty door and the photo every time the lightning flashed. The photo portrayed the same doorway, but the figure was gone. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. I didn't remember there being visible cracks like that. My sweat-soaked fingers gripped the thick blanket tightly. Creaks, groans, and moans sang throughout the cabin. The smell of mold seeped through my blanket. I stared, wide-eyed, into the black void of the hallway and noticed. two glowing eyes flickering subtly, only a few inches off the ground. My breath escaped me. The blood left my face, hands, and feet. Trying to hold still, my body shook involuntarily. Lightning lit the room as thunder tore the sky open, but the hallway remained dark, except for the glowing eyes staring back at me. Breathing in short bursts, I tried my best not to move. I wondered if maybe the owner had a cat I didn't know about or anything to make sense of this. Boom, the eyes at the edge of the darkness began to slowly rise. I watched as they did. I gasped as they rose a foot off the ground. Then 2 feet, 3 feet, 4. The wood began to groan as if a weight on the boards was getting heavier and heavier. Boom. The creaking of wood became rhythmic, like breathing. Hollow moans came from every direction. The walls shook violently, and the window began to rattle. Claps of thunder were one after another, and lightning was so persistent that the room was lit nearly continuously. The eyes were now 6 feet off the ground and rising further, growing larger. As lightning struck, the outline of a figure began to take form around the eyes. They reached the top of the door frame, but only continued, disappearing above. My leg twitched and reflexes kicked in. Without thinking, I threw the covers off myself. Boom! I thrashed my legs out from under the covers, stepping onto the icy floor. A board creaked under the weight of my foot, and I lunged for my backpack. The eyes, now noticeably bigger, immediately lowered back into the doorway. As I grabbed the strap of my bag, a large, dark, claw-like hand grasped the doorframe, so hard I heard the doorjamb begin to fracture and splinter. I lunged toward the window, and with the backpack as a shield, crashed through the thin glass, landing on sticks and dirt. The only noise louder than the thunder and shattering glass was the high-pitched scream from the hallway. I tumbled to the ground, pushed to my feet, but stopped running as soon as I had started. My eyes squinted as the bright light from the sun washed me in warmth. I dropped my backpack and shielded my eyes until they could adjust. Sweat dripped off my clothes and shaking body. I took a couple of steps forward, crunching twigs and glass under my feet. I turned around and saw the broken window. The cabin itself was tattered, old, and worn down. It didn't appear to be in safe standing at all. But I slept in there. I walked around for a moment. Trees and hills extended as far as I could see. Smoke in the distance and the sound of cars honking every so often. The town I was looking for was just over the hill. I walked around to the front of the cabin. The wooden sign I had seen was still there. Airbnb was jokingly spray painted on the front of the sign. The graffiti covered a withered notice from the community nearby. Do not enter. Derelict. Subject to demolition. Police tape that once covered the entrance was scattered across the ground. What strands remained attached to the cabin now blew carelessly in the wind. I slung my backpack around my shoulder and walked back around toward the broken window and peeked inside. The room I slept in was destroyed. Sunlight was peeking through broken boards in the ceiling. A small broken sink hung off the wall by a loose pipe, dripping water steadily onto the floor. The mattress was covered with faded stains and protruding springs. A torn winter blanket lay on the floor. The bedroom door was shattered. A couple of worn pieces of wood hung only by their rusty hinges, and a picture lay on the floor, leaning against the wall. A photo of a gentleman standing in a doorway. My wife and I recently got married. It was a beautiful service that went great and everyone had a lot of fun. After the reception, we drove about an hour to another city where our plane would be leaving from the next day, so we spent the night there. Our first night together was wonderful. We were both exhausted from all of the excitement and slept very well, despite it being our first night sleeping together. The next day we flew to Portland, Maine, and got our rental car and off we went. We drove about an hour and a half, got some delicious seafood at a local restaurant, then continued on our way to our Airbnb we would stay in for half our honeymoon. We arrived about another hour from the restaurant after driving through some twisty back roads to a tiny cabin in the woods behind our host house. We checked in, got the key, and began to settle into our cozy honeymoon cabin. When you walk in, you are greeted with a tiny living room connected to a tiny kitchenette, with a tiny bathroom barely big enough for one person, and a small bedroom with a decent amount of space around the queen bed. Seriously, this place was very small, but it was cozy, and it was romantic for our honeymoon getaway. After getting settled in, we started to take the cabin in, all of the decorations, the atmosphere, everything. Something caught our eye, a carved wooden sign on the wall between the kitchen and the bathroom read, "Don't piss off the fairies." We both laughed since we found it funny and cute. Then we started to notice something. All of the decorations were fairies. Pictures, small statues, and even a scroll for the annual fairy festival. Our laughter turned to slight chuckling. Then we stopped laughing altogether when we noticed one special picture, a stoic-looking woman with a flower crown on her head. The picture was unsettling, almost like it was watching us. We had a nervous laugh about it. We don't believe in that kind of thing, but the decorations and atmosphere was a bit unsettling after that. We decided to go out to dinner, since we didn't have any food with us. Another delicious meal of local seafood and a stop at a dollar store for a few snacks, and we return to the cabin as the sun is setting. We ignore the fairy surroundings and get down to business as you do on your honeymoon. After we finish, we have a good laugh about the fairy stuff and both agree it's less creepy and more funny. The next morning we awake with a few bug bites. We think a mosquito must have gotten in the cabin and had a good meal on us, but we don't think much of it. The strange thing is they don't itch like bug bites normally do. We decide to ignore it and continue with our day. After we get ready for the day, we both notice another carved wooden sign. This one says, "Looks like the screw-up fairy was here today." We both look at each other and ask if either one of us noticed it yesterday, which neither of us did not. Slightly creeped out, we decide to leave for the day to enjoy the sights of the area. When we return in the evening, we notice nothing has changed, as we would expect. We realize we just missed the new sign yesterday. Our night goes pretty much the same as the previous night. Get down to business, laugh about the fairies and how ridiculous we were being getting creeped out by it, then fall asleep. The next morning, we notice even more bug bites like the day before. Again, they don't itch, which is strange. We took a closer look at the bites and noticed they were not your typical bug bite. The bites look almost like tiny human teeth. We start to check all of the bites. They all look like tiny teeth. As you can imagine, we started to panic a little. There isn't a bug that has tiny human teeth. Where did they come from? We decided to quickly get cleaned up and leave for the day since we are now visibly worried. Just as we are about to leave, I noticed the picture of the stoic woman looks slightly different. It used to look straight-faced and stoic, but now looks concerned or slightly angry. I was the only one to notice just as we were going out the door, but decided not to mention it to my wife, so as not to upset her more. After a day away from the cabin, we were feeling slightly better, but still worried. We decided to stay the last night since we have reservations at another Airbnb the next day, located a couple hours away. We did not sleep well that night and woke up with a few more bites, which we noticed still look like tiny human teeth. We quickly cleaned up, packed up, and left. Just before I walked out the door, I checked the picture of the woman. It seemed slightly more upset than the day before, but it was hard to tell for sure. I am starting to wonder who that woman is or was, and if whatever was biting us will follow us or got trapped in our luggage. I really hope to be rid of this whole thing once and for all. Not Airbnb, but couch surfing, literally what it sounds like for those of you who don't know. My friend was planning on staying on a random guy's sofa for the weekend in Rome, and I decided to go with her since it sounded dodgy as hell, and she wouldn't listen to reason. As I expected, the host had failed to mention that said couch was in his bedroom along with the only bathroom. On the first night, he was steaming drunk and sat on the couch talking incessantly, so we couldn't go to bed. We were very clear that we planned to explore without his guidance, but we kept running into him all over Rome. We met a couple of guys and nearly didn't go back to his place the second night, but since it was super late, We thought he might already be asleep. He was, but guess who we woke up to staring at us first thing in the morning? He tried to convince us to stay another night and got very pushy about it. We took him out to dinner instead as a thank you and then headed out. Again, we just seemed to keep running into him. We couldn't shake him until we left the region, I swear to God. My cousin told me this story. She and her friend were backpacking up the West Coast. They stayed at this Airbnb and immediately got creepy vibes from the guy. He offered them weed, which they politely refused, and he also introduced them to Becky. According to my cousin, Becky was pale and wearing booty shorts and a tank top. The guy said she was staying the night. They said hi and then went back up to their room for the night. They were so creeped out that they put every piece of furniture against the door and window except the bed. That night, they didn't sleep much. At about 3 a.m., they heard someone rustling around with the garbage bins. They got up early the next morning to get the hell out. The guy was awake when they walked downstairs. They remained polite and said good morning. He offered them breakfast, and they said no. He insisted, so they said they'd just have cereal. While eating, they asked if Becky would be joining them, and he replied with a straight face and a dead stare, "Becky isn't here anymore." Yeah, they left 5 minutes later. A few years back, my girlfriend and I and 5 other couples rented this really nice cottage a few hours away from us. It was February, so we still had a fair amount of snow on the ground, which meant for skating on the lake, building snow forts and having a few drinks in them, and building a fire to keep warm. Saturday afternoon rolls around, and we've all had a few, enjoying ourselves in the winter sun, and we hear a car pull up out front. I was going up to stock the cooler, so I went to check out the noise. I walked out to the driveway and find a dude in a suit with a family, mom and dad, and 2 kids maybe 8 and 10. Can I help you? Yes, I've got a showing here. I've checked with Stacy and she ocked it. I'm not sure who Stacy is, but we've rented this out for the weekend. The guy was a realtor who was in contact with one of the kids of a recently passed man who owned the place. Stacy was trying to get the cottage sold, and her brother was renting it out on Airbnb and didn't communicate when they'd have guessed, and when the realtor was having showings. I end up getting a call from the brother, and he lets us know it's cool and to let them in. I told the guy it's sort of a mess right now, nothing broken or anything, but we've got empties everywhere, probably unmade beds, suitcases that had clothes strewn about. He said tidy what we can, it's no big deal. So I rallied all of our friends, let them know the situation, and we all drunkenly piled the empties on the kitchen table, hit the various paraphernalia that some of the guys had, and tucked clothes away so there weren't underwear on the floor of the bedrooms they were showing. We did it rather quickly, and sort of just awkwardly stood in the kitchen while this poor realtor showed the cottage. A group of 12 definitely not sober adults trying not to make it any worse while this family comments on the house. I highly doubt the dude made the sale, but it was definitely a weird experience having to participate in a spur-of-the-moment showing while buzzed. Me and my best friend rented a tiny bungalow with a detached bathroom right on the beach in Belize. We have traveled a bit and make it fine on our own. Our last night in this maybe 200-person town, we woke up to shrill screaming. We would have sworn it was just outside the window. Our minds wound over the slur of possibilities, but after 5 solid minutes our adrenaline wore off, and she went to use the bathroom out the back door. She beckoned me over. The house maybe 200 feet away was an inferno. We watched until daybreak until it was contained. Everyone was extremely solemn. Took a bus out soon after. Turns out some locals got in a tiff with some resident and expat in the day. Murdered them and burned the place down in the night. So, my siblings, grandma, and I were staying in a camping cabin. Not in the middle of nowhere, but in a pretty secluded spot. Around 11 p.m., We are hanging in the living room of the cabin on our phones when I suddenly hear the doorknob of the cabin jiggle. I instinctively turn in the direction of the door to see what is going on. Unfortunately, the window of the door is made of this smudged material, so I can only see the figure of someone. As soon as I look, the figure outside moves away. I get this uneasy feeling mostly because I've been listening to a podcast about the Golden State Killer, and as I get up to check the door, my sister tells me not to open it. She had the same feeling as me and tells me we should lock the rest doors and windows. Nothing happened the rest of the evening, and we all went to bed. If nothing else happened the rest of night, we probably would have forgot about the incident. But the next morning, as we were getting ready, my grandma told us she saw something odd in the middle of the night. According to her, she was awoken at 2:30 a.m. for no reason. But as she looked towards the window, she saw a tall, dark shadow standing on the other end of curtains of the open window. She told us that as soon as she looked, the figure moved on. She then quickly got up and closed the window. I've got one. I stayed in an Airbnb in Boulder, Colorado. I was staying with a nice family. I didn't talk to them much. I was really only there to sleep at night. The rest of the time I was exploring the town, going out to eat, hiking up Lover's Leap Trail, etc. Well, one night, I was woken up by a blood-curdling scream. Mind you, I am a paranoid man who is used to having some form of protection on himself at all times. At least a knife, if not a firearm. Since I took a flight here, I had neither of these things. The scream was blood-curdling. I mean, it woke me up from a deep sleep. I legitimately thought someone was being harmed. After jumping out of the bed and rushing into the living room, I saw the three individuals that were nice enough to host me, sitting on the floor, looking at a laptop on the coffee table. One of their grandparents had passed away, and the news sent one of them into a panic attack. Me, being a random individual that has barely had a conversation with them, outside of greeting and thanking them when I first got there, felt heartbroken for them. I also felt awkward. I had no idea what to do. I eventually said, "Sorry for disturbing you," or something along those lines, then went back to bed and gave them their space. Not as creepy once I learned what was going on, but it did scare the shit out of me. I mostly just felt bad I was there during a time like that. I've lost pretty much all of the family on my dad's side, so I know what they were going through was rough. If y'all somehow see this, I'm so sorry I was there during a personal time, and I wish there was something I could have done for y'all. I was a 23-ish naive small woman, and I was moving to a new city in a month, but my lease expired, so I was staying in Airbnbs for that month. I was only staying in places where the hosts were women, but I showed up at one and the host wasn't there, just a guy around my age who said he was host's brother, and she was out of town for the night. I was already creeped out because it was an old Victorian house with an overgrown yard, tons of wind chimes, everything creaked when you walked the whole shebang. But it was late, I couldn't afford a hotel room, and I had nowhere else to go. In the middle of the night, I was woken by this truly awful cat yowling noise. I distinctly heard someone walk up creaky old house. I saw the hallway light come on under the door, heard them shoo the cat away, and the light went off. But no steps walking away, so I'm laying there waiting to hear retreating steps, and then very clearly the doorknob was jiggled. I have never been so scared in my entire life. I would have jumped out of the window and run away if it hadn't been a third-floor room. Instead, I held a lamp as a weapon, waited a few hours, then literally ran out the door and got the F out of there. I still have nightmares about it.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.